Human trafficking is modern-day slavery. Worldwide, nearly 21 million people are victims of human trafficking. Even though we see and think of it as an international crime, it also takes place in our local communities. The UN reports forced labor into slavery and human trafficking is a $150 billion a year industry. This comprehensive training video will give you an in-depth, behind-the-curtain look of human trafficking from a micro-perspective local level. The objectives of this training video are as follows. Understand how human trafficking impacts the local community, understand common scenarios, identify characteristics of traffickers and their respective recruitment tactics and locations, identify characteristics and vulnerabilities of potential victims, identify signs that indicate that a person may be a potential victim of human trafficking, identify resources to further assist victims of human trafficking. Human trafficking can come about as sex or labor trafficking. Both types of trafficking are defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for commercial sex act or for labor or services, both of which are induced by force, fraud, or coercion, for the purpose of subjection to involuntary servitude, debt bondage, or slavery. In the case of minors, force, fraud, or coercion is not necessary to qualify as human trafficking. Human trafficking is an ongoing hidden crime. The general public and media oftentimes report about the crimes by incorporating common myths. Human trafficking is not smuggling. Smuggling is a violation of a border, whereas human trafficking is a violation of the victim's human rights.
Sometimes human trafficking is mistakenly referred to as smuggling. Smuggling and human trafficking are not interchangeable terms. Smuggling is a crime against the border, and the majority of those involved are willing participants who have a quickly identifiable goal of a place that they want to be. Human trafficking is a crime against an individual.
Human trafficking is not prostitution. It's an element of choice and willing participation by adults, whereas human trafficking victims are forced into prostitution.
One of the myths is that human trafficking is prostitution, and nothing could be even farther from the truth. Human trafficking involves forced labor and forced activity in the commercial sex industry, including the exploitation of children. It is often overlooked and difficult to detect with those people who are being kept inside the homes and inside the businesses and don't enjoy the freedoms that you and I do.
I think there's a lot of misconceptions about human trafficking. I think one of them is about labor and sex trafficking, that there's only one or the other, or that they even only exist apart from each other, but actually they can intertwine quite a bit. I think also when we think of human trafficking, a lot of times we have one scenario set in our mind of this is what human trafficking looks like, but we really need to broaden our eyes, and if you see something that just doesn't look right, but it doesn't look like the stereotypical situation, investigate anyway, because chances are there's something to that instinct.
Trafficking with the labor and sex trades can be blended. The most common example is the massage industry. The massage industry has a long history of potentially being a mask for the sex trade. The individuals are recruited for their labor, and they are forced to work long hours without a day off at a substandard pay, and then they are coerced and even forced to commit sexual acts to enhance the profit being made by these offenders.
Common scenarios that we've seen or across the country are things such as, I think the most common, or the one that's out in the public eye in the media the most, is the sex trafficking of minors. And although we've seen many minor victims of trafficking in the commercial sex industry being forced into the commercial sex industry, there's other scenarios and other cases that are somewhat common. Things such as domestic servitude. Other scenarios would be in the back rooms of restaurants and forced into doing some of the scrubbing and cleaning in the back of a restaurant. Other scenarios would include potentially corner sales, such as flowers and fruits and vegetables. When we look at some of our corner vendors, we have to wonder, why there's no shade, There's nothing but maybe an upturned bucket to sit on. Another scenario that we see, particularly in this country, is foreign workers that are contracted by what we would call labor contractors here in this country to provide some of the labor that our country is built on, and contractors is really the middleman. Another common scenario that we see, door-to-door sales crews, traveling sales crews, magazine sales, that exploit vulnerable youth.
Who are victims of human trafficking? Victims of human trafficking are of all gender, ages, ethnicities, and socioeconomic statuses. These victims may be vulnerable because they're victims of past violence and abuse, they're financially vulnerable, runaway and or homeless youth, temporary visa holders, or undocumented foreign nationals.
From a very young age, as far back as I can remember, I was sexually abused by my father. At about the age of 7, he started taking me to what he called running errands, but really he was selling me for sex. He would take me to all kinds of different places. He would take me to hotels, people's houses, warehouses, recovery homes, and he would take me to be sold there for sex, and different men, women, and sometimes even couples would come and pay for me.
Victim self-identification is difficult because they may not self-identify as a victim, refuse help from law enforcement and victim service providers, run away from shelters and other placements, express loyalty and obligation towards traffickers, lie or provide rehearsed stories, be defensive, disassociated, and embarrassed, have unclear or disjointed memories.
The difficulty in identifying and rescuing victims from a law enforcement perspective is the time that it takes to overcome their fear with law enforcement and gain their trust. These victims have been trained to lead a life of a false identity and run from the police.
Victims of trafficking have a complete distrust and fear of law enforcement, social workers, really anybody from the outside who would be able to help them.
Conversely, most are surprised to understand that traffickers live amongst us and look like the average citizen. Traffickers are people who exploit others for profit. They can be any demographic, age, ethnicity, or gender. Traffic individually or in groups such as street gangs and as part of organized crime. Business owners or labor contractors are also common types of traffickers.
These people, there wasn't any one certain type of people. It was all kinds of people from different races, ethnicities, and socioeconomic backgrounds. My family life growing up looked pretty normal from the outside, but it wasn't from the inside. My father was a preacher, my mom did daycare, but what was going on behind closed doors was a very different story.
Human trafficking can occur anywhere. Offenders of this crime have been exposed in the most affluent communities and neighborhoods. It involves every culture and ethnicity.
Sex and labor traffickers feed off of victims' pre-existing vulnerabilities. Potential victims can be recruited in several scenarios, such as socially, through a friend, at a party, word of mouth, in a public place, online through social media, socialization websites such as My Redbook or Backpage, place of residence or shelter, including foster care system, and bus stops.
And what happens oftentimes is it's very subtle. It's a grooming process. We understand what the grooming process is when we talk about child molestation. This is the same thing. There's a grooming process of vulnerable children by traffickers. In addition, vulnerable youth that are recruited often are promised the very things that they need so badly: love and protection and safety and family and relationships that they don't have in their homes. That's very alluring to either our vulnerable youth or even vulnerable adults. Things that they're lacking. A trafficker knows exactly what that person is lacking and how to exploit that need.
Through the use of psychological manipulation and deception, traffickers lure in victims by using several of the following tactics: showing romantic interest, or known as boyfriending, promises of safety and economic survival, potentially posing as a benefactor, false job promises, or abduction. Human trafficking is a very hidden crime, and for that reason, identification of victims can sometimes be difficult. Some of the possible indicators of human trafficking are under 18 and providing commercial sex, not free to leave or come as he or she wishes, owes a large debt they're unable to pay, recruited through false pretenses, signs of physical and or sexual abuse.
I didn't know any different. I didn't like my life. I didn't like the things that were happening to me, but I didn't know that other people didn't live that way. That was normal. I didn't know, and I didn't have the vocabulary to reach out and ask somebody for help. As a teenager, I started learning that this wasn't normal and not everybody was abused. And when I tried to reach out for help, people didn't know what to do and just thought I was being a teenager and complaining. I also tried to refuse to cooperate with my father and not have sex with people, and I was beaten severely for not cooperating.
Human trafficking is a relatively new term in our culture, and victims of trafficking don't often know that they're even victims of anything. And so it takes all of us, all professions, law enforcement, service providers, mental health workers, healthcare, runaway and homeless youth serving organizations, faith-based communities, and our general public to be able to recognize some of the signs and the red flags of trafficking.
The local landscape of human trafficking is ever-changing. We hope to continue the fight by continuously learning more about the causes and trends. Law enforcement, alongside victim service providers, needs the local community to educate themselves of the signs.
We have created public awareness materials. We've created partnerships, an entire coalition called the Central Valley Freedom Coalition, partners who provide various different services to our very diverse population of victims. And we continue to facilitate and serve as liaison across the state and across the country with other anti-trafficking organizations, because most victims tend to be moved around, and we definitely need a good and strong network of victim service providers.
It was a tricky question, how was I helped? Because at the time, there wasn't information about human trafficking. People didn't know about it. They didn't know what was going on. I didn't even have a name for it at the time. There wasn't any programs or any outreaches or anything like that. For me, I feel like God was a big part of getting to the people that I needed to get help. And it was community members and people who found out that I was in a really desperate situation, even if they didn't know all the details, and gave me opportunities to help myself. They gave me an opportunity to get a job. They helped me be able to get the counseling that I needed. So concerned people that maybe didn't always know what to do, but decided they were going to do something.
For our foreign national undocumented victims of human trafficking, there is special benefits that are available to them. One is called the T visa, or the trafficking visa, for those who are fully cooperative with a law enforcement investigation. It offers them some immigration relief so that they can stay in country during the investigation, and also allows them to work legally in the country.
I would say the most important thing is don't doubt yourself. When something doesn't seem right, victims or survivors may not be able to always tell you with their words, I need your help. They may be asking in other ways for help. But if you see it in their eyes, you see someone who's very fearful, or you see someone that just looks like they're empty. You just look in their eyes and there's an empty look. Or their behavior is very unusual. To investigate, take a step further, ask some questions. Don't leave that person without trying to help them in some way. Now, it has been a long journey to get where I am now, and it is a long road. And human trafficking is not something that, you go to a couple counseling sessions and you get better, but it is where you can arrive in a place where your past doesn't control you anymore. Moments like these are great, because if I can help one person, or if I can help somebody help one person, then it brings so much purpose to my pain and meaning to my life. I am happily married, and I am finishing up a degree in crisis counseling. I work locally with youth who have experienced sex trafficking or sexual abuse, and I plan to use my degree to continue my work with children and youth who have experienced trauma.
Human trafficking impacts all of our communities, whether it's our local community, state, region, etc. It impacts all of us. We have to think about the financial resources that are necessary to address human trafficking, whether that's from law enforcement perspective and the time it takes for detectives to investigate properly these cases, or it's from victim service providers who are providing the absolutely necessary services to victims to help them become whole again. It takes all of us to recognize human trafficking, to do the right thing by the victim of human trafficking, to prosecute the traffickers and hold them accountable. And that's why training is so important.